Here we'll focus on J.P. Moreland's arguments for dualism. We'll also mention another argument, and we'll, in part 2, consider some criticisms of J.P. Moreland's arguments for dualism. One of the things that Moreland does initially is he presents a criticism of physicalism as a worldview. So some reasons that people are physicalist or reject dualism as a theory of the philosophy of mind is that they are physicalists, naturalist. The idea is that the only things that exist are physical things. And physicalism as a worldview would rule out dualism, right? There couldn't be any immaterial substance, the mind, if everything that exists is physical. So Moreland initially has just some broad criticisms against this worldview. Physicalism leaves no room for certain things that most people believe exist. Numbers, right? How large is the number 7? How much does it weigh? What color is it, right? Those don't have any answers because the number 7 is not a physical object. And yet, of course, we believe in numbers. Laws of logic, the principle of affirming the antecedent or denying the consequent, otherwise known as modus ponens and modus tollens. Those are laws that exist that help us reason clearly, but they're not physical objects, right? Scientific theories, the theories themselves are not physical objects, yet they exist. Social theories, political theories, other kinds of theories are not physical objects. Deficits, now that would be nice if a deficit were a physical object, then maybe we could destroy it, right? So Illinois runs a large deficit. Well, we could just go in, where's the deficit? Let's just burn it, now we don't have any more deficit. Of course, it doesn't work like that. Moral principles are not physical objects, and of course, there's God as traditionally conceived is not a physical object. So physicalism would rule out any of these things. So Moreland says, if you think that any of these things on this list exist, then you shouldn't be a physicalist, and that undercuts one reason for rejecting dualism as a view of the philosophy of mind, right? If any of these things exist, they are not physical things. So you should not accept universal physicalism, at least. Now, that's not an argument for dualism, but it's kind of getting a blockade out of the way so that then he can make arguments. Now, before we get into his arguments, I want to think about something else. Let's consider a criminal case. Now, the purpose here is it's going to help us understand a very vital principle that Moreland uses for his arguments. So let's say that there is a perpetrator P who set off a bomb behind a Bruno's bar in Macomb, Illinois on October 13th. And this is what we know about the perpetrator. Maybe there were eyewitnesses, maybe there was a security camera. In any case, we have this information. The perpetrator was 5'10", had dark hair, was thin, wore red size 10 Converse All-Stars, which left a track in the dust back there. He was wearing an orange Bears hat. He knew how to make an incendiary device, or knew someone who did, and he was in the alley behind Bruno's bar in Macomb on October 13th. That was all observed. We know those things are true about the perpetrator. Now, suppose in the process of investigation, we discover a suspect, and we find that the suspect is 5'10", has dark hair, is thin, wears size 10 Converse All-Stars, often wears an orange Bears hat, and people have seen him before at Bruno's bar. We have really good reason to think we found the perpetrator. All of these characteristics matching up. Plus, we find out that he conducted recent computer searches on how to build an incendiary device. He's been looking up how to make a bomb. So we are very confident we have the right person. However, suppose we find out that without a doubt, our suspect S was in Florida on October 13th, the entire day, including the 12th and the 14th. He was clearly, absolutely, we know he was in Florida, not Macomb, Illinois. So what follows? Well, what follows, of course, is that we've got the wrong person. Our suspect is not the perpetrator. Now, why not? Why do we know that? Because our suspect was in Florida and the perpetrator was in Illinois. Now, what's the principle of reasoning that we're using? What kind of basis are we making this judgment? And philosophers call this principle the indiscernibility of identicals. And here it is in an informal, very direct way. If X is identical with Y, then X and Y have all properties in common. Every characteristic that's true about X is going to be true about Y if X is identical with Y. If X is one and the same thing as Y, then they share all properties. And so if the suspect is indeed the perpetrator, then they have all properties in common. If the suspect just is the perpetrator, if we have the right person, then everything that's true about the suspect is true about the perpetrator. And we can state this formally for if X is identical with Y, that's the X equals Y, and it's an if because we have the arrow, if then, right? If X is identical with Y, then every property that X has is a property that Y has, that's the arrow going to the right, and every property that Y has is a property that X has, that's an arrow going to the left. Okay, if you like formal things, there it is. If you don't worry about it, just focus on the way we just stated it. Now, since we know that the perpetrator was in Macomb on October 13th, but we know the suspect was in Florida on October 13th, that's why we concluded the suspect is not the perpetrator. It's because of this principle, the indiscernibility of identicals. Okay, so that principle is broadly accepted. Nearly every philosopher agrees that it's true. We use it whether you recognize it or not. Obviously, investigators would use this principle if they were investigating this bombing that occurred. So everybody understands it, we use it, it's accepted as true, we know that it is. All right, what does that have to do with dualism? Well, let's consider how we might apply what I'm going to now call the I of I, short for the indiscernibility of identicals. Well, suppose the mind just is the brain. Suppose the mind is a physical object, and what physical object would it be? If it is a physical object, it would be the brain, right? What else? Then every property that the brain has, the mind has. And every property the mind has, the brain has. That's following our principle. It's just an application of the principle. If they're the same thing, then they have all properties in common. And so whatever's true of the brain is true of the mind and the other way around. Now, if we can find a characteristic that the mind has, but the brain does not, then that would show us that the mind is not the brain, in the same way that finding out that our suspect was in Florida when the perpetrator was in Illinois, that showed they cannot be the same thing, even though all those other things were in common. Even though everything else was matching up, all it took was the one difference, and we knew that the suspect was not the perpetrator. It's the same principle here with the mind and the brain. Okay, so let's make sure we're clear on this. Just because something is always present with something else, it doesn't mean that they are the same thing. So for example, the shape of an apple and the color of an apple, just because they're always there together doesn't mean they're one and the same thing. The head side of a coin and the tail side of the coin, they always are together, but that doesn't mean that they are the same thing. So just because two things are always together doesn't mean it's the same thing. So just because a neurophysiologist could identify some brain event every time a person has a mental event, like thinking of an apple, that does not mean that the thought of an apple is the brain event. A lot of people have argued that this does show the truth of, say, the identity theory, but clearly that alone does not. Just because they're together all the time doesn't mean that they are the same thing. Okay, now let's go to the general argument. Let's think about it broadly first and then more formally. There are several attributes that mental states have, but brain states lack, and others that brain states have, but mental states lack. And because of that, Moreland concludes mental states are not brain states. And of course, if mental states are not brain states, then the mind is not the brain. And if the mind's not the brain, what physical object would it be again? The mind must be something that's non-physical if it's not the brain. So that's the broad rationale of how he's reasoning here. Now, what properties are we talking about? What properties are there that mental states have, but brain states lack? Well, here are four, just broadly speaking. One set of mental states do not have a length or a mass or a location, but parts of the brain do. Mental states are such that we have private access to them, but we don't have private access to our brain states, right? We don't need to ask someone else, am I hungry now? I know I have private access to my experience of hunger. I don't need to ask someone else if my knee is in pain. I have private access to that. I don't need to ask someone else, can you see what I'm planning for the weekend? I forgot. You know, those plans are within me. Now, yes, memories can be forgotten, but if we have plans, we have private access to them. We know what our plans are. We know what we're experiencing in our mind. But we don't have private access to our brain states. We can't just reflect and think, oh yeah, my left hippocampus is really excited right now, or oh, there's extra activity going on in my parietal lobe on the right side. No, we don't have that private access to our brain states. Another thing, third here, we cannot be mistaken about our mental states, but we could be about our brain states. So for example, if you're hungry, well, you're hungry, you know that. You're not mistaken about that. You feel hunger, that's the way it is. If you feel a pain in your head, you have a headache, well, you're not mistaken about that. So for example, if you go to the doctor and you've had a headache for a long time, and your doctor looks you over and asks you questions, and he just says, I don't think you have a headache. Well, that's not a doctor you want to continue talking to, because you know you have a headache, right? You're confident about it. But you could be mistaken about brain states. If the doctor takes you seriously and go through tests and you eventually have an MRI, say, and then you go back to see the doctor shows you the MRI on the screen and he says, we found a problem here. This is why you're having a headache. You've got this aneurysm in your right parietal lobe and it's really pushing hard there. And then he says, whoops, oh no, that's my previous patient's chart. So you could be looking at it and for a moment think that you had this aneurysm, but that was a mistake. You were looking at somebody else's brain, right? That can happen. We could easily be mistaken about what's going on in our brain. And then finally, our mental states have a first-person subjectivity. Brain states don't. So for example, when you sense knee pain, you don't look around the room or wonder who's having knee pain. It's you. It's I'm having knee pain, right? You don't have to try to figure out whose knee pain it is. We have a first-person recognition of what's going on in our mind, in our mental states. But that's not the case with brain states. Like the previous example, When you're looking at an MRI and the physician is telling you something that's going on in your brain, you don't know if that's you or somebody else, right? You don't have that first person access to it, the first person subjectivity. Okay, so we have these differences between mental states and brain states. We have our principle of the indiscernibility of identicals. So let's put this in the argument. So here's Moreland's argument. It goes something like this. If X and Y are identical, then X and Y have all properties in common. So we have the I of I. We're just using that principle, which means, of course, if the mind and the brain are identical, then the mind and the brain will have all properties in common. And if the mind and brain have all properties in common, mental states and brain states are going to have all properties in common. But mental states, as we just mentioned with that characteristic, the third one that we considered, mental states have the property of our having private access to them. And brain states don't, right? Brain states do not have that property of our having private access to them. I just realized that wasn't the third one we mentioned. That was the second characteristic we mentioned in any case. We're talking about private access. Okay, so mental states and brain states do not have all properties in common, right? Mental states have that property, brain states don't, so they don't have all properties in common. So the mind is not identical to the brain. And if the mind's not identical to the brain, the mind's not identical to any physical object. So the mind is an immaterial substance that exists apart from the brain, which is the thesis of substance dualism. Now, before we move on to consider some criticisms of Moreland's argument, let's consider one more argument. So this will be our third argument, right? This is based on personal identity. Now, physical objects need to maintain their parts in order to maintain their identity. If you loan your computer to someone and they take out the RAM and replace it with much inferior quality RAM, they remove the processor and they give you a really old processor and those kinds of things, and then they give the tower back to you, that's not your computer anymore, right? You say, wait a minute, this is not the computer that I loaned to you. This is something else. Physical objects have to maintain their parts in order to maintain their identity. But consider your body. Your body loses parts continually. So while you've been watching this, you've been breathing in and out. And with that breathing in and out, some of the hydrogen and oxygen that was once part of you is now flowing out into the atmosphere around you. If you just scrape your fingers against a desk, you've just scraped off a bunch of cells from your skin. And of course, we lose parts in other ways. And obviously, when we go to the bathroom and things like that, right? So our body loses parts all the time, but it is, so at the pace, the current physiologists say that a human body is entirely new after about 7 years. After about 7 years, you don't have any more molecules that were there 7 years ago. So your body is entirely different from the one you had, say, 8 years ago. So take your age, subtract 8, your body is entirely different from that body that you had. And for most of us, there are clear differences that we can recognize from our bodies compared to at least 8 years ago. But then when you think back about, say, your kindergarten pictures, those pictures are of you. They're not of somebody else, right? That's your kindergarten picture. So that means that you must not be a physical thing. right? If the kindergarten picture is you, but your body is completely different from what it was when it was photographed in kindergarten, then you don't have the same body at all. So you can't be a physical thing, right? Physical objects have to maintain their parts in order to maintain their identity, right? So that's a third argument for dualism, right? We've had the modal argument, as it is called, the one based on the possibility that I exist without my body. We saw that in the Introduction to Philosophy of Mind video. Then Moreland's argument based on the I of I, and then this argument based on personal identity. So we have three different arguments for dualism, and that's sums up reasons why dualism is considered to be true by many, including Moreland and philosophers like Flanagan. In part two, we'll look at some criticisms of the arguments that Moreland presented.